a todos, muchachos. Es un placer para mí pues saber que están ahí detrás y que están pues justo para nuestro siguiente ponente, Pietro Maruyama Mendonça, que yo lo encontré, yo lo conocí en esta plataforma muy linda que no sé ustedes, pero a mí me conviene mucho, que es ResearchGate. Y entonces yo ya había visto uno de sus artículos sobre una revisión de los polinizadores, los insectos polinizadores en ambientes urbanos. Y entonces de ahí lo contacté, contacté a Pietro, le dije que si por favor podría darnos un seminario, porque obviamente en nuestro laboratorio tenemos este interés pues muy grande de los insectos en ambientes urbanos. Y él muy contento, muy tranquilo, muy amablemente me dijo que sí. Y entonces este es el título de lo que nos va a hablar. Antes de que comience, les voy a leer un poquito de su currículum. Pietro es un chico muy joven, es un chico que se acaba de doctorar apenas hace 6 años, en el 2015, de la Universidad de Campinas, en Brasil mismo. Y hace un par de años, en el 2019, consiguió un puesto de profesor en la Universidad Federal de Minas Gerais, que es donde está ahora, en Belo Horizonte. Y lo que él ha trabajado, pues bueno, es la interacción entre polinizadores y plantas a distintas escalas, desde el organismo hasta la escala macroecológica. Ha usado colibríes y las plantas como sistemas de estudio y bajo un enfoque de red, ¿no? Tipo network. Pero también está interesado en otros grupos de polinizadores, incluyendo pues lo que yo les decía, lo de insectos. Después dice aquí, me mandó un textito, dice: después de pasar mucho de mi carrera trabajando en ambientes más naturales, recientemente he empezado a trabajar con interés de entender cómo las interacciones plantas y polinizadores y sus servicios ecosistémicos asociados se mantienen en las áreas urbanas, con especial énfasis en las regiones tropicales biodiversas del Cono Sur. Entonces, con eso, yo de nuevo le agradezco mucho a Pietro que nos hable de esto. Él me pidió que lo diera, por favor, en inglés. Yo sé que ustedes son pues capaces de entender esto, no hay ningún problema, pero también se disculpaba porque pues no lo podía dar en español. Pero bueno, tenemos recuerden, después o durante la ponencia, pueden textear sus preguntas en la zona de chat de aquí de Meet, o al final tomar directamente el micrófono y preguntarle a Pietro lo que ustedes tengan de dudas o comentarios o opiniones. Thank you very much, Pietro. So it's all yours. Start whenever you can, and thank you very much again.
Muchas gracias, Alex, por la invitación. And as Alex said, I will speak in English, and I'm sorry for that. But if you have questions at the end, you're welcome to also ask me in Spanish, because I'm able to mostly understand when you speak very slowly. So my name is Pietro. I'm an assistant professor in the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil, as Alex said. And this presentation is about some of the recent research that we have been conducting in our research group. The theme of this presentation, so it's centered around the urbanization, biodiversity, and with specific focus on the pollinators, which are the group that I have been working for a long time. So just to put the research in context, we now live in a world where most of the human population, they are found in what we call urban areas. So there has been a transition from most of the people living in rural areas to urbanized areas, which are characterized by buildings and impervious surfaces. And this expansion of the urban population has also meant that there has been an expansion of this very specific kind of landscape at the cost of the natural habitat loss. So we know that millions of square kilometers of habitat has been converted for human use in the world, and one of the main drivers behind that is also the transformation of natural areas to urban areas. So these are the trends, as well as some forecast of how this land use transformation is happening around the world. And one thing that is important to notice is that although urbanization is a world phenomenon, this is not happening at the same pace around different parts of the world. In fact, most of the highest rate of transformation of natural to urban area is happening at the lower end of the income when you consider the different countries around the world. So this means that most of the transition of the natural area to urban ones is actually happening in regions that we know as biodiversity hotspots located around the world, which tend to be located in many of the countries in development. Urbanization, usually we think that it has such a drastic negative effect on biodiversity because many times these landscapes, they do not support suitable areas for wildlife to persist. So many times they are known as possible biological deserts with low diversity of organisms. However, when across these urban landscapes, urban green spaces are promoted and maintained, actually urban areas may also work as an important tool for the conservation of biodiversity, and by doing that, also promoting the conservation of different ecosystem services associated with nature. So this is just a short introduction, but the biodiversity found across the urban landscape are associated to provisioning of different benefits to people, including here one interaction that I have been working a lot, which is pollination, or the association of plants with biotic pollinators, mostly insects, that are essential for their reproduction. This interaction is not only important for the maintenance of natural community, but also for provisioning of food, because many of the crops that are important food source for us, they are also dependent on pollinators for production. So I guess most of you have noticed that pollination is one of the big hot topics that has been discussed a lot in the context of ecosystem services. And this is also true for the urban context. So in the recent years, there has been lots of different and very influential studies that have been published about the diversity of pollinators across urban areas. But as you can see here, most of these influential studies, they are coming out from authors that are based on temperate and very wealthy countries, which, as I said before, it's not necessarily where urbanization is happening at a more drastic way. And also, when we consider the importance of some ecosystem services, and you consider the importance of pollinator for food production, one thing that may be especially relevant when we consider the perspective from the global south, where we are located, is that these urban pollinators found in the urban landscape may be actually much more important here, where we have societies that are characterized by high inequalities, and with initiatives such as promotion of urban agriculture with community gardens, as these ones here shown in Brazil, maybe could contribute to provide food security and so directly benefiting the human population found in different cities across these developing nations of the world. So just to further stress the importance of urban biodiversity, it has also been argued that conservation of such biodiversity in the city has a very important role in promoting social and educational values of the nature by promoting a very close contact of the general public with nature, which may in turn then lead them to be more more welcoming to nature conservation initiatives and supporting such policies when they actually know what we are talking about when we talk about nature and conservation of it. So in this context, I'm going to present some example studies that we have been conducting in our research group. I will start with a recent global review on pollinator studies that we finished. And this was the study that Alex saw in ResearchGate and later contacted me to participate in these seminars. So this is a contribution that we made for a book that will be published next year on tropical urban biodiversity. And my collaborators and I, we wanted to assess the global trend on the production of knowledge about urban pollinators. And so what we did was to conduct a systematic survey on the literature up to 2020 using some simple keywords, and then serving all the resulting studies that came from the survey, and extracted data on the geographical coordinates or where these studies were conducted and the pollinator groups that has been studied at each of these studies. For the results that I will present here, we only conducted analysis at the order level because the amount of data was very big, and it has been very time consuming working with this database. But we are now working also with a more detailed assessment that hopefully we will be able to finish up and submit soon. But the results that we have are based on then the survey of more than 700 studies that we screened, and then from these, we were able to eliminate 200 just by doing taking a very quick glance on the studies. But then of the remaining 500 study, we checked them in detail, and then ending up with a little bit more than 300 studies that had information on the geographical coordinates and group of pollinators that were studied. So this is the resulting data that is plotted in this map. And as you can see, you have a very biased geographical distribution on pollinator data from urban areas across the world. This is also separated by different groups. But see here that in some of the regions, we basically don't know anything about what kind of pollinators are found across urban areas. At the same time, you have some regions that has been very frequently being studied. But one interesting summary when considering the taxonomic distribution of the organisms found in the urban areas of the pollinators is that most of the studies, they consider in these urban areas Hymenoptera, or basically bees, which are in fact the most important pollinators. And then in smaller amounts, some studies also considered flies, butterflies and moths, beetles, and then some vertebrate pollinators that are mostly important in the tropics and not very well represented in the temperate regions. So there is this bias in the geographical distribution of the studies. But anyway, studies has shown that there is a huge diversity of insect, mostly pollinators, found across urban areas across the world. When we compare this production of knowledge between the tropical and, for simplicity, non-tropical region, but basically considering the temperate region, we see that in fact this is a topic that has been studied a lot. And when you consider the recent development, there has been a very fast increase in number of studies being produced for the topic of urban pollinators. But this is very different when you contrast what is being produced in tropical regions in contrast to non-tropical regions. And this acceleration for the non-tropical regions is actually happening much stronger than for the tropical regions, where we know that most of the biodiversity is actually found. And when you consider then the production of knowledge according to different order of the pollinators, and also you also find that the production of knowledge is happening much faster for the temperate region, especially here for Hymenoptera, which is driving the overall trend, with the exception of the birds, which overall has small number of studies because they are also numerically less important as pollinators. But here you do not see a difference. You don't see a difference because it wouldn't make sense also to have more studies on birds in the temperate region anyway, because they are not very important as pollinators there. So this global review is just to set the context of what has been produced, and this is what we explore in the book chapter. But there has been an accelerated increase in number of studies produced about urban pollinators. But what we have now is that 3 times more studies has been produced in the temperate region. And if we look at this in more detail, you see that most of these studies are actually just coming from the wealthier nations in the world. So we have that there is an important mismatch between the regions where you have high biodiversity and when actually urbanization is also happening at a more negative, at a larger scale, and the studies that has been conducted. So after setting this context from the global literature, I want to present another review that we published recently, but here focusing on a very large tropical country, which is Brazil, where I'm originally from. And this study was published actually before the book chapter that I just presented, but I think it makes more sense to present the global context and then come here to what we have in Brazil. And in this study, we took Brazil, which is a very large country and also known for its very high biodiversity. And it's also, fortunately for us, it has a very long tradition on pollinator studies. So there has been many researchers along the years who has been studying pollination here in Brazil. So we actually had a lot of data to work with, and we conducted a literature survey in Web of Science and Cielo, looking for all the studies that had information here, not only pollinator occurrence, but interaction of these pollinators with their food plants across urban areas in the country. So for this review, we found 87 studies that had suitable data on identified pollinators interacting with plants that we extracted, which gave us something more, a little bit more than 300 species of floral visitors, more than 500 plants interacting with these floral visitors. But as you can see here in the map, even when you consider one country, you have a strong geographical bias. In this case here, we also have a bias according to the ecosystem which has been studied. So in Brazil, we have different ecosystems going from very large rainforests to more savanna-like environments. But most of the study, when you consider biodiversity studies in general, has been conducted here in this region along the Atlantic coast in Brazil, where we find the Atlantic forest, which is also one of the biodiversity hotspots. But most of these studies were conducted inside this ecosystem because this is also where most of the human population in Brazil is currently found. So many of our biggest cities are actually found across this Atlantic forest ecosystem. And it's also where most of the urban development has been happening. So although there is a bias on the ecosystem and geography, this is actually reflecting human occupation. So for the context of our study here, it's not that negative. But one thing that we found out when conducting this survey and this review is that in Brazil, we have a particularity that most of the study, they were conducted inside institutional areas, mostly here, university campus. This happens because university campus in Brazil, I'm not very familiar with in Mexico, but I think it's also the same case. We have this huge urban landscape with a lot of vegetation. So they usually have large areas with a lot of green spaces. And also because it's much easier for researchers to conduct their research inside the institutional areas than going outside and having to contact private landowners and conduct their research. So this data that we have for Brazil is somewhat biased, yeah, considering the specific type of urban green spaces that has been sampled. But anyway, considering that still this information has some relevance, we use the information on the interaction between pollinators and plants from Brazil across the urban areas to construct an interaction network between plants and pollinators, as you can see here. And we conducted an analysis that is called Modularity Analysis. I'm not going to go into detail on specific network analysis, but basically here what you have is that different colors, they are reflecting different modules. And these modules, they reflect subunits of interactions where you may find preferentially interacting partners. So you have some kind of biological affinities that determine these different modules here. And when we look into detail what species are in these modules, what we have is actually that these are reflecting some taxonomic differentiation on the pollinator groups. So in the module 1 here in this light blue, we have actually a higher presence of bird pollinators. And in contrast, in this module 5 here in darker blue, we have a higher prevalence of bee pollinators interacting with plants. So what we found here is that these module conformations, they actually reflect some preferential interaction that are organized according to the different pollinator groups. But it's important to also mention that although there is this differentiation, when we consider the overall diversity of pollinators found in this review, what we found is that across the urban landscape, bees are the most important pollinators found across the urban landscape in Brazil. Another thing that was interesting from this study is that when you look at the different modules of and analyzing the composition of the plant species, is that all of these modules had a high proportion of plants that are exotic or they were introduced in Brazil. And this is very common when you consider urban vegetation, right? Because most of these plants are used for gardening and afforestation. And it is a trend that in many cases, especially here in our countries, that these plants are mostly exotic species that were brought from different regions of the world. But we also found that, at least from the pollinator perspective, there is no difference in, let's say, importance of these different group of plants, because we found that pollinators, they use equally the exotic and native plants. As you can see here, where we compare the number of different pollinator species associated to the group of native plants in contrast to exotic plants. Of course, this is a very broad assessment, and there may be some native plants that are very important, but this is overall picture showing that exotic plants are also relevant as floral resources for these pollinators across the urban area. And then we use this network that we compiled from the studies to conduct some other analysis. Here, in this plot here, I'm showing the result of the species level analysis conducted from the network data. Again, I'm not really going into detail, but we calculate these two indices from the network data and the conformation of the modules, where you can use the value from these two indices and combination of them to identify the most important species giving cohesion to the network. So the species found here in this right upper panel, network hubs, are the species that are considered the most important for the network. And as you can see here, you have many species of Hymenoptera. These are all bee species that were found as important network hubs for the network on plant pollinators. The species with the highest number of interaction was the exotic honeybee, but we also had native social bees, stingless bees, such as these two species that were also highly abundant across the urban landscape, interacting with many plants. And then one species of hummingbird and one species of butterfly that I'm also highlighting here because these are the only two species that are not bees that were identified as network hubs or important species through this analysis. But one thing that is common across all these species found here, when you consider the natural history information, is that there are all species that are known to be very generalized in their habitat use. So what we find here is that the species that are mostly found using floral resources in the urban area are those that are generalist and then able to persist in this modified habitat. When we conduct the same analysis for plants, here we are illustrating the difference according to the plant habit. So we separated trees from shrubs and other forms. And what we find here is that actually we were expecting trees to be very important for pollinators, but we found out that shrubs are very important. So we have species that are commonly used urban landscaping here in Brazil, including one exotic species, Tecomustans, which is very frequently used because they have these, it has these very showy, large flowers. And just one species of tree, which is a native species from the Atlantic forest here in Brazil, but it's also used in different regions. So it's a country, within country exotic species in some regions, as being the most important resources for the urban pollinators in Brazil. And these are all species that are heavily used in urban landscaping and gardening here in our country. So just to finish up with some illustration, I want to just present overall results on other groups of pollinators that we have also been working. And so these three studies with hummingbird, which is the group I have been working mostly, show that also for this group, you have a loss of more specialized hummingbirds from the urban landscape. And at least for this group, it's very important if you want to attract them in the urban area is to have some very specialized bird flowers. I know that in Mexico, you also have many species of hummingbirds and some specialized flowers that are pollinated by this group. So you need to have these plants that act as somehow act as exclusive floral resources for these birds, where they don't really have to compete with other floral visitors, such as insects, if you want to attract these pollinators in a more urbanized area. And also in this second study, we found out that phenology was very important for the organization of the network between plants and pollinators in the urban area, which calls attention that if we want to conserve pollinators in the urban environment, we have to really have a better planning on when each species will be flowering and thus functioning to support this pollinator across different seasons in the year in the urban landscape. So I hope that it wasn't really too fast, but I just want to finish with some take-home message that I have, summarizing all the studies that I presented to you. What we have been finding here, conducting these studies that are not the mainstream in the scientific literature, because most of the knowledge has been produced from the temperate region, is that also in the tropical urban areas, you find a high diversity of pollinators, especially insect pollinators. So more studies are needed so that we are able to properly conserve these pollinators found in the urban landscape. But some of the initial findings, they suggest that also here we end up losing some specialized species of pollinators, which probably has important consequences for the provisioning of ecosystem services, because it is known that you need to also conserve more specialized species in the wider pollinator community so that you may have a higher benefit for plant reproduction in the community, as well as the provisioning of ecosystem services. And lastly, at least from the review that we conducted in Brazil, one important result that we were able show is that the different group of urban pollinators, they use different sources of nectar. So it's also possible to say that different group of pollinators, and also considering within different group of insect pollinators, they are probably going to respond differently to the same disturbance caused by urban environments. So there are some studies in Europe, for instance, already showing that while some species of bees, they are benefited, even benefited by urbanization, other groups of important pollinators, such as solitary bees and flies and other insects, they face very negative consequences during this process of urbanization. So we need more studies, especially here where there is not much done yet, so that we are able to better assess how urbanization is affecting the wider pollinator community, not only in some specific regions of the world. So thank you, and I'm open for any questions that you have, some of the things that I probably didn't explain very clearly. And please, you can also ask them in Spanish, and I'll try my best.
Thank you very much, Pietro. No, that was very, very clear. At least to me, it was very concise and clear. Gracias, chicos. Si tienen alguna pregunta, ya saben, pueden usar directamente el texto. Lo pueden hacer en español con el chat, pero también pueden incluso tomar el micrófono y preguntarle a Pietro directamente.
I'm
Pietro,
just going to close my presentation.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Thank you.
So, Pietro, I was going to ask you, there was, I'm now typing a reference that came out recently in ecological entomology that was in this year, actually, that this is an issue a special issue on insect extinction. And this paper is not surprising, really, but it tells you that, the introduction of many non-native plants in different parts of the world is contributing substantially to insect extinction, precisely given the interactions with, with the original plants, the native plants, with the different local pollinators, predators, whatever, and. So can this be like an extension of what you have, like, in these reviews, you assess, for example, whether those insects, for example, that are interacting with the non-native plants are like actually introduced or, kind of to tell you something in terms of whether insects are going extinct because of this introduction?
Yeah, well, so I have to first make very clear that I'm not advocating for the exotic plants, and especially in the natural area. But when we are considering the urban landscape, it's a reality that many of the plants that we have is actually exotics, because these are many times the species that are easier to produce seedlings, and also for management, forestry, and so on. So I'm not very optimistic that we can really ban all the exotic plants from urban landscaping. I think that whenever it's possible, we should promote native plants. And about the question if I think that these plants may be contributing to decline of the insects, that's a very good question. I don't know if in Mexico you have this plant, but in Brazil we have a plant introduced from Africa, which is called African tulip. It's a very big tree with showy red flowers, and it apparently produces toxic nectar that is toxic for insects. So there has been some early reports showing that it could cause mortality for bees, for instance. But I don't think that there is anything conclusive. So yes, it's possible. Also because we are not only talking about pollinators, right? And if you take, for instance, butterflies, and the adult will feed on many different kind of plants going after nectar, but the larva is very much specialized, so they need probably the native plant that act as a food source for them. So I don't know. My answer will be we don't know very well this dichotomy between exotic and native plants and their role in supporting pollinators in urban areas. That's actually one very interesting thing to investigate, I think.
The other question I was gonna ask you is, do you know anything like about the selection that has taken place on these pollinators? Like, for example, whether these urbanized areas are selecting, for example, for small pollinators, as it is the case usually for the whole, bunch of animals that are in urban areas?
So actually, that's a very frontier, in the very frontier of science on urban ecology, this question on how urban areas are driving evolution. And there are only some few studies that has already investigated that. I know one study with bumblebees in Europe, and they show that apparently urbanization is driving increase in the body size of these bumblebees. If I'm not wrong, I think it has something to do with heat uh, management. I'm not very familiar with insect physiology, but these
And
larger
what about
bumblebees.
birds, for example? Is that the same, like large birds?
Yeah, so for birds as well, I think so, because they can more easily dissipate the heat. And so, and actually this is nice because it also has a consequence for the plants, because larger bees, this study, they found that actually they promote higher pollination. So it probably will also have consequence for the evolution of plants. But there are only few studies, I think, with um, evolution of animals and plants across the urbanization gradient. And this is a very hot topic that anything that you are able to conduct research on this, you will be able to publish in very nice journals, and people will really find that interesting.
Now, when you look at the ecosystem services that these animals, these pollinators provide, versus the amount of vegetation that is present in the urbanization area, is there like an index of like how much vegetation we need inside the city in order to sort of get the most of
And
the ecosystem services? Is there anything like
uh,
that? Can we reach something like that? I mean, this is for urban planners, this is information that they
yes,
would like to
yes,
have. Like, okay,
of
so how much
course.
vegetation do we need in order to still provide like ecosystem services by these
Yeah.
pollinators, and what kind of plants?
Yes, that's something that I don't think we already have an answer as well. And it's very difficult because it's not just that you need to have vegetation in urban area. It also depends on type of the vegetation you have. It doesn't really matter if you have these very extensive lawns with grass that with very little number of flowers, which actually would be considered as a potential green area for the urban planners. But actually, from the perspective of the pollinators, it's the same, mostly the same as having a different impervious surface. So I don't think we have this kind of information on threshold where you need to have this amount to have proper ecosystem services. And most importantly, I think this will probably vary a lot across different regions or different type of ecosystem that was originally there. So for instance, here I'm in a city that is located at the transition between the Atlantic forest and another, which is a forest ecosystem, and a savanna-like ecosystem, which is called Cerrado. So even with inside the same city, probably we have a difference where it was originally a Cerrado area and where it was originally an authentic forest. So I don't have an answer for that.
Right.
But that's something that people will probably be trying to look for in a more applied sense, applied science
And
approach.
your local authorities, are they like keen on like, for example, suggestions in terms of, yeah, like
Yeah,
pollinators,
at
ecosystem?
least here in the city that I am, it's one of the cities in Brazil that has been promoting a lot urban green areas and urban agriculture for food security. So it's an administration that is more interested in promoting these nature-based solutions. Also because when they do that, they are able to attract external funding, right? For sustainable cities, there are many ways on that the public administration can get foreign money to be invested in a city by promoting sustainable practices. So here I'm in a city that it's more open to that. But if we consider the wider context of Brazil, I'm sure you have seen the news. We have a
Yeah.
government that it's not very open for nature conservation. So it
Mhm.
will depend a lot on where you are based, I think.
That is sad because that happens the same here. I mean, it depends at the end on the local authorities at the level of like small towns.
Yes,
That it is those guys that actually take the decisions, the big decisions. You know, it's not the president. I mean, the president can say many things,
yes,
but locally, they have
of
more
course, of
power.
course.
They can have more power, and it depends on the education, right? If they are like educated people, those local authorities, then you can do many nice things. But on the
Yes, yes.
opposite side, if they are not educated, that's a disaster.
That's why we have to try and meet the general public, not only stay inside the university or even with this administration, the public authorities. We have to go to the wider public because those are the ones who will be voting and also asking the city authorities to implement policies regarding nature because an administration can always change, right? We have
Yeah.
election every 4 years and you may be constructing something that is very nice with them, but next year they lose the election and then everything is lost. So you need to really try to make contact that goes beyond this administration level. And I think that's the challenge when you work with urban ecology because you always need to like deal with people. It's different when you work in a natural area because you just go to a field station, conduct your study, and sometimes there will be someone that may be not very happy with you there, but mostly you don't have to deal with people. But when you work in the urban area, you have to deal with people all the time, and that can be very challenging.
That can be challenging. Yeah. Well, we have a question by Elsie
Yes.
Jarillo. Yeah, I think she's asking you whether you know if lepidopterans are affected by artificial light, I guess,
Yes,
during
that's
pollination.
actually very interesting question, and thank you. And there have been some very recent and high-profile study published in these big journals, Nature something, or that has shown that artificial light, especially depending on different type of artificial light, it can have an impact on the pollination process conducted by Lepidoptera, especially moths, nocturnal moths. They may be negatively affected by artificial light. I can try to find the reference and send it to Alex, and then he can send it to you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. But it's a very
Now
good
we have
one.
a question over there. Una pregunta alguien quería hacer. Pietro, in the meantime, can you type your email address on the text section so people can
Yes.
contact you?
And I also can read Spanish, so don't worry, you can contact
Sí,
me.
si quieren usar, preguntar, incluso directamente con el micrófono.
I'm just a bit shy. try very bad Spanish.
Okay, that's great. So we have.
This is actually wrong. Sorry.
Yeah, Giovanna, Michelle, can you puedes preguntarle, Michelle?
Hola, ¿sí puedo hacer mi pregunta en español?
Sí.
Ok, en las áreas en las áreas con alta diversidad de polinizadores que están en zonas urbanizadas, esta alta biodiversidad se puede deber como a que hay zonas verdes como parques cerca y que eso permite la alta biodiversidad, o es que están cerca de zonas rurales. ¿Qué estrategias se deberían de buscar para mantener como esa alta biodiversidad en las zonas urbanizadas?
Okay. So what you find usually is that you have higher diversity in the urban areas in comparison to the surrounding rural areas. So you have higher diversity of pollinators in the urban areas in contrast to rural areas. This is because in most of these rural areas, if it's not a natural vegetation area, what you have are these crop plantations that they are only attractive for the pollinators during the flowering season of some crops, right? And in contrast, in the urban area, people really like to have very beautiful flowers. So they will plant flowers that are very attractive for us. And usually these flowers are also very attractive for the pollinators because they're big, showy, and they have more rewards for the pollinators, such as nectar and pollen. So yeah, it's more like what kind of plant that we find in this urban environment. And what we find there is that usually you have highly attractive, including exotic plants that are very attractive to for the pollinators. So if you want to keep this high biodiversity, what we have to do is provide a lot of diverse floral resources. And then also one thing that is very important, especially for the insect pollinators, is that you also need to provide them with nesting sites, right? So there are many initiatives that are constructing these bee hotels. I don't know if you have seen those, but nesting places for bees that they can use. And this also works on promoting biodiversity of pollinators in the urban area. So there are many different things that can be done, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe I got lost my answer. I hope something that I said made sense.
No, I think that was what she was asking actually.
Okay.
So if there is no one else asking, si no hay nadie más, perdón, preguntando o con algún comentario, sí, gracias, Michelle. Pues ya vamos a vamos a concluir esto. So Pietro, thank you very much. That was really cool. Thank you for being with us and for showing us what you're working on. I suppose you have been doing this work, taking advantage of the being locked up in during this pandemic, right?
Yeah.
One has to do something with the data that is already published, right?
True.
Yeah.
But also because I think it's important, at least from us, that we are located in countries from the global south, right? That to show that we need more research here as well. It doesn't matter that we continue producing only knowledge from these wealthy countries, that it's especially because some of their findings may not apply to what we have in our reality here. So I really wanted to call attention to this disparity in the production of knowledge. So hopefully in the future, we are able to also participate in the big table and be part of this conversation on the conservation of pollinators.
Thank you very much, Pietro. So yeah, that was very interesting, and so this is time to say goodbye.
Yes.
I hope to
Muchas
see you.
gracias.
No problema. So please remember the invitation for the review paper in ecological entomology,
Yes.
and let me know if I can do anything, if I can be of any help. Okay.
Yes, you too. If you ever come to Brazil, please get in contact with those guys.
Ok, I'll let you know. Muchas gracias a todos. Que estén muy bien. Una linda tarde. Gracias, Amara. Gracias, Álvaro. Hasta luego a todos. Chao, Pietro.
Chao.
No, creo que no, porque